I was speaking about this yesterday with Stuart Wallace, and this was my first Qatar Economic Forum, and I've got to think that this year geopolitics have really been front and center. Yesterday, a lot of the discussions that took place were very much focused on geopolitics and also Qatar's role, because we know that Qatar have been playing a mediation role in energizing and putting forward these Israel-Hamas truce discussions. And yet the messaging from the PM yesterday, I've got to say, seemed pretty pessimistic about the future of those talks.
Yeah, he came across as a man who seemed almost at the end of his tether here. Yes, you're right. The geopolitical discussions, particularly, the theme of this year's QEF is navigating a year of uncertainty. So I suppose it's appropriate that the first day the discussions were about war, hot wars, Gaza, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the Cold War between the United States and China. The morning session was the Qatari Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, both of them making very impassioned pleas for a ceasefire, but also, I think, acknowledging that we're not anywhere near there yet. And this Israeli invasion of Rafah, which is continuing, has, as the Qatari Prime Minister said, put things back. We also heard from President Duda of Poland, who made, again, a very strong case saying that the world must not allow Russia to win in Ukraine. And he's obviously very anxious himself. He pointed out that if Russia were allowed to win in Ukraine, it wouldn't end there, that other countries in Europe, NATO countries, including his own country, Poland, would then face, he felt, aggression from Russia. So that was really quite an opening session.
Yeah, it really was.
And then at the end of the day, we had Ken Griffin of Citadel talking about the Cold War. And his view was that the U.S., the Biden administration, was not really working towards peace in the Cold War, if you like. He was quite critical of the decision to increase tariffs on EVs.
Yeah. I mean, a lot to digest, and some of it, as you say, is in reflection, direct reflection of the latest news that we're getting in that space. Interesting as well that Secretary of State Blinken made a visit to Kyiv yesterday to reassure the Ukrainians that the U.S. is on board, that $61 billion of aid that was agreed in the package a couple of weeks ago is going to arrive, even though it's going to take some time. But again, from your standpoint, and I know, you have a perception and analysis of the world geopolitics right now, I walk away from those sessions feeling slightly worried about the state of these both hot wars and cold wars.
There was a lot of anxiety on display, particularly from President Duda, because, of course, the Blinken trip to Kyiv comes against a backdrop of reports of Russia making actual advances into Ukrainian territory. There were concerns that the aid package that the U.S. finally agreed upon, that took too long and that the aid might not reach the Ukrainians in time. Duda pushed back against that a little bit. He said that, yes, the ammunition and the arms that the Ukrainians need will reach them in time for the expected spring offensive from the Russians. But there was a lot of anxiety, and not just on the stage, but in the room, as I was talking to business leaders from around the world who are here. They're trying to factor in these things into their plans. So when we hear from General Petraeus today, he's a former military commander, former director of the CIA, he'll be talking about security risks worldwide. And I think the audience, sort of coming off that anxiety of yesterday, will be listening very closely to see if there's any reason for optimism in the months ahead.
Well, in my conversations with some of the local finance ministers, I had a conversation with the Saudi finance minister a couple of weeks ago in Riyadh. Yesterday, also Qatari finance minister. They all say the number one risk right now is actually geopolitics and security risks. You've got to think in the region. That's not a surprise. I just want to pick up also on Ken Griffin, because you mentioned that last conversation that he had yesterday, a really fascinating insight. But one thing that stood out to me is he has more of a, I don't want to say sympathetic, but perhaps he's a more realist approach in how the U.S. should be handling China. And that really stood out to me as a business leader from the U.S., given the state of politics in the U.S. right now, because both sides of the aisle are pretty hawkish when it comes to the relationship with China.
You're right. He does sort of plow his own furrow on China, and not a lot of people in the U.S., certainly not a lot of people in Washington, take the same view as he does.
Yeah.
But he has been pointing out that some of Biden administration's policies are self-contradictory. So he says, look, Biden, on the one hand, Biden says he has these green policies. He wants to reduce carbon emissions. On the other hand, he's making it harder for Americans to buy cheap EVs from China, and that these two things don't really fit each other. He's not a big fan of Biden. He on stage talked about Donald Trump. I think it was fairly clear that his favored outcome in the elections in November will be if Trump were to win the presidency. But it's not just an ideological position he's taking. He's talking about economics, and he's talking about the need to cool, or let's say warm up the temperatures in the Cold War.